The chandeliers at Hartmore House blazed with the buttery glow of 1,000 candles, spilling light onto the swirling silks and powdered wigs below. The Duke of Ashworth stood among a tight circle of gentlemen, his champagne glass tilting lazily as he surveyed the dance floor with the detached amusement of a man who had long ago tired of society's offerings. He was tall, dark-haired, and possessed of a lean, angular face that many women sighed over and most men envied. His title, his fortune, his impeccable tailoring, all of it made him a fixture at the center of any room. To his right, Lord Bexley chuckled at something unsaid. "Ashworth, you look dreadfully bored. Surely someone here merits your interest." The Duke's gaze drifted across the couples forming for a quadrille. It snagged on a figure near the far wall, a woman in silver-gray silk, her posture straight, her expression composed. She was not dancing. She rarely danced. Her hair was a subdued gold, pulled back simply, and her jewelry was modest. She might have been mistaken for a companion or a poor relation, someone one glanced at and forgot. A slow, unkind smile touched the Duke's mouth. He tipped his head toward her and spoke in a voice pitched only for his companions, but carrying with theatrical carelessness. "She is my wife." Lord Bexley barked a laugh. "You're what, Ashworth? That is a rum joke. You married to that little mouse." Another gentleman snickered. "I've never even seen you speak 2 words to her." "Precisely the point," the Duke murmured, and lifted his glass as if toasting his own cleverness. Laughter rippled through the group. It was a small cruelty, the sort of careless barb that might dissolve into the general noise and be forgotten by morning, except the woman in silver-gray had heard. Lady Margaret Ashworth, Duchess in name if nothing else, had been standing near enough that the Duke's drawl reached her with awful clarity. Her gloved fingers tightened around her fan. For 3 years she had endured the polite fiction of their arrangement, a marriage forced by family debt and sealed in a terse ceremony where her husband had not once met her eye. She had been tucked into a corner of his life like an unfashionable piece of furniture, ignored in public, tolerated in private. She had borne it because the alternative was ruin, and because she had once been foolish enough to hope. The hope had withered long ago. Now, as the laughter fizzed around her, she felt something shift. Not anger. Anger was too hot, too impulsive. What settled over her was a cold, crystalline clarity. She would not shatter. She would not weep. She would walk across that floor and remind the Duke of Ashworth that a wife was not a punchline. She moved. Her slippers made no sound on the parquet, but the crowd sensed something anyway. Heads turned. Conversations faltered. The gentlemen around the Duke fell quiet as Margaret approached, her calm more arresting than any outburst could have been. She stopped an arm's length from her husband. The Duke's smile tightened. He had the look of a man who had carelessly kicked a stone and now watched it roll toward a precious window. "Your Grace," Margaret said. Her voice was quiet, perfectly steady, carrying no trace of the humiliation that throbbed in her chest. "I hope I did not mishear you." The Duke's eyes narrowed. A public scene was not in his repertoire. "Margaret," he said, low and careful, "perhaps we might speak privately." She ignored the warning. "You introduced me as your wife. I merely wish to confirm it, because for 3 years, I confess, I have wondered what title I actually hold." She paused, letting the words sink into the listening silence. "Indeed I am, Your Grace, though I had hoped you might recall it without mockery." A soft gasp fluttered from Lady Horning, who had edged closer. Someone tittered, then choked it back. The Duke of Ashworth opened his mouth. No sound came. The great orator of the House of Lords, the man whose cutting remarks left politicians stammering, stood completely speechless. His jaw worked. A flush crept up from his starched cravat. Margaret held his gaze a moment longer, not with defiance but with a quiet, devastating dignity. Then she sank into a flawless curtsy, rose, and walked toward the doors. The crowd parted for her as if she were royalty. She did not look back. The Duke's hand, still holding his champagne glass, had gone white at the knuckles. Behind him, Lord Bexley whispered something that might have been an exclamation. The music struck up again, too bright, too brittle. Outside in the cool night air, Margaret pressed a hand to her stomach and drew a shaking breath. She had done it. She had spoken. And for the first time in 3 years, the mighty Duke of Ashworth had been rendered mute. She climbed into the carriage alone, and as the wheels rattled over cobblestones, she allowed herself one small, fierce smile. The townhouse on Curzon Street lay shuttered in gray pre-dawn light when the Duke returned. He had delayed long hours at his club, nursing a brandy he did not taste, enduring the sly glances of men who had heard some version of the ballroom debacle. Every retelling made the jest sharper and his silence louder. By the time his carriage clattered home, his humiliation had fermented into a cold, simmering rage. He found Margaret in the library. She sat in a high-backed chair near the window, a book open on her lap, though she had not turned a page. She had traded her ball gown for a simple wool dress, and her hair lay in a loose braid over one shoulder. She looked up as he entered, and her expression was not fearful. That unsettled him more than tears would have. "You made a spectacle of us," he said, shutting the door with a deliberate click. "Was that your intention?" Margaret closed her book. "I responded to a spectacle you created. If you wished the marriage to remain invisible, you might have refrained from announcing it as a joke." He stalked toward the hearth, gripping the mantle. "Do you have any notion of what they are saying now? That the Duke of Ashworth is henpecked, that his wife shamed him before half the ton." "And what were they saying before?" Margaret rose, her voice still quiet but edged. "That the Duke of Ashworth had a shadow wife he was too embarrassed to acknowledge, that I was a piece of furniture you had forgotten you owned. Tell me, which version better preserves your pride?" He spun. "You might have spoken to me, in private." "I did speak to you. Do you remember the week after our wedding? I asked if we might travel to the country together to become acquainted away from prying eyes. You said, and I quote, 'I have no appetite for pretense.'" She let the words hang. "You established then that my voice had no weight. I merely decided last evening to find a voice that did." The Duke stared at her as if seeing a stranger. The Margaret he recalled from those early months had been soft-spoken, hesitant, her eyes following him with desperate hope. This woman, composed, incisive, utterly unafraid, was someone he had not bothered to meet. "I will not be made a fool of," he said, though his tone had lost its bite. "Then do not act the fool." Margaret moved to the small writing desk and drew out a folded paper. "I have drafted a petition for a formal separation. I will retire to the dower house in Wiltshire. You may continue your life exactly as before, unencumbered." He snatched the paper, scanned it, and tossed it into the cold grate. "Denied. I will not have my affairs dragged through the courts. We remain as we are." Margaret watched the paper curl in the fireplace. She had expected this. "Then understand this," she said, turning back to him. "I will no longer be your hidden shame. I will attend every event you attend. I will sit in your box at the opera, dance at your balls, and drink tea with your mother. If you will not grant me a legal separation, then you will grant me a public existence. I refuse to vanish." He came closer, close enough that she caught the faint scent of brandy and bergamot. His gray eyes searched her face, and for the barest moment something fractured in his expression. Not anger, confusion, perhaps, or a grudging flicker of respect. "You've changed," he said, half to himself. "I have not changed. I have simply stopped waiting for you to see me." She walked to the door and paused with her hand on the latch. "Good night, Your Grace, or good morning, I suppose. We shall face the world together tomorrow. It seems you have no choice." She left him standing in the empty library, the first gray light catching the dust motes suspended around him. The Duke lowered himself into the chair she had vacated. The book she had been holding was a volume of poetry. Blake, he noted idly. He could not remember the last time he had watched her hands turn a page. He could not remember ever asking what she liked to read. The silence of the house pressed in, and for once it felt less like peace and more like a reproach. The season, which had begun as a tedious parade of predictable faces, transformed into something else entirely. Margaret Ashworth, long ignored, became the subject of intense fascination. Ladies who had once overlooked her now sought her company, hungry for details of the ballroom confrontation. Margaret navigated these encounters with quiet good humor, revealing nothing and making no enemy. She danced when asked, though always the less intimate reels and country dances. She laughed politely, discussed the weather and the latest exhibitions, and conducted herself with the smooth grace of a woman who had nothing to prove. Lord William Stirling entered her orbit at a musicale. He was a widower of modest fortune and considerable kindness, with warm brown eyes and a gentle manner that never presumed. He did not whisper about the Duke. He did not leer with pity or curiosity. He simply asked Margaret if she enjoyed Vivaldi and listened to her answer as if it mattered. Soon his presence became a quiet constant. He escorted her through the park at the fashionable hour, his horse ambling beside her phaeton. He sent her books he thought she might like, with no accompanying note of expectation. At Lady Braithwaite's garden party, amid the roses and the drifting sound of a string quartet, he made his offer. They stood near a weathered stone bench, partially screened by a trellis heavy with climbing roses. Lord Stirling spoke in an undertone, his eyes on a distant fountain. "I know something of difficult marriages. My sister endured one for 14 years before her husband's death released her. There are legal avenues, quiet ones, if a lady wished to seek a separation. I have the means to assist, without obligation or condition." Margaret studied his profile. "Why would you offer such a thing, my lord? We have known each other barely a month." "Because you deserve to be seen," he said simply, "and because it pains me to watch a woman of your spirit being treated as an afterthought. I ask nothing, only that you know the door exists should you ever choose to walk through it." She did not accept. She did not refuse. She thanked him with a sincerity that made her voice catch, and they walked back to the party in a companionable silence. The Duke, standing at the edge of the terrace with a glass of lemonade he despised, had observed the entire exchange. He could not hear the words, but he saw Stirling's earnestness, Margaret's slight nod, the way the sunlight fell on her hair. Something hot and uncomfortable twisted behind his ribs. He recognized the sensation with a jolt of disbelief. Jealousy, primitive, irrational, and thoroughly unwelcome. That evening he appeared at her dressing-room door. She was seated at her vanity while her maid brushed out her hair. He dismissed the maid with a curt gesture, and Margaret watched him in the mirror, her expression guarded. "Lord Stirling seems attentive," the Duke said, leaning against the doorframe with artificial ease. "He is a gentleman," Margaret replied. "He speaks to me as though I have a mind." The jab landed. He acknowledged it with a slight tightening of his jaw. "I do not approve of the association." "That is unfortunate," she said, "because I find his company agreeable and I intend to continue it." He took a step into the room. "Margaret." She turned on the velvet stool and faced him fully. "You have no right to approve or disapprove. You surrendered that right the moment you called me a jest to amuse your friends. I am your wife in name only. My friendships are my own." The Duke's hands hung at his sides empty. He looked at her, really looked, and saw the steely resolve beneath the calm surface. This was not petulance. This was not a bid for attention. This was a woman who had quietly, methodically, stopped loving him. "What do you want?" he asked, and the question came out rawer than he intended. Margaret considered him for a long moment. "I wanted what every woman wants, to be known, to be valued. You denied me that from the first hour. I am not sure there is anything left to want from you." He had no reply. She turned back to her mirror, and after an interminable pause, he walked away. His footsteps echoed down the corridor, and Margaret closed her eyes, her heart a steady, painful drum. The weather turned fine in May, and with it came a flurry of invitations. The Duke of Ashworth, who had once avoided any event his wife might attend, now made a point of appearing wherever she was. He did not impose himself directly, but he hovered, fetching her punch, offering his arm when the ground looked uneven, standing guard at the edge of her conversations with an expression that hovered between brooding and protective. Margaret observed this campaign with a mixture of wariness and reluctant curiosity. She did not encourage him, she did not rebuff him. She waited like a chess player assessing a new strategy. He invited her to dine with him alone one evening. This was unprecedented. They had shared countless meals in silence at opposite ends of a long table, but this was different. A small round table set with candles, the dishes chosen to her known tastes, the servants dismissed after the second course. He asked about her day. He listened, haltingly, awkwardly, to her account of a visit to the Foundling Hospital. He did not interrupt. Afterward, he suggested a stroll through the conservatory. It was his mother's pride, a glass-domed jungle of palms and orange trees. Moonlight filtered through the panes, stripping the flagstones with silver. He stopped beside a marble bench. "Margaret, I must ask you something." She waited, her hands folded. "Why did you stop looking at me?" he said. "In the beginning, you looked at me as though I might become something. Then, after that first month, the light went out. I never understood why." Margaret exhaled. The memory rose, sharp and undimmed. "The day after we wed, I came downstairs early. You had guests, Lord Bexley, Mr. Thorne, 2 others. I heard my name and paused outside the door. You said to them, 'Well, it is done. The lady is an unfortunate necessity, but at least she is quiet.'" The Duke went rigid. "You heard that?" "I heard it," she said. "I stood in the hall in my new morning dress, the one I had chosen with such care because I hoped you might find me pleasing. And I understood in that moment that my place in your life was a transaction, an embarrassment to be endured, so I stopped hopping. I stopped looking." Her voice was terribly calm. It was easier to feel nothing than to feel unwanted every hour of every day. He closed his eyes. When he opened them, his face was stripped of its usual arrogance. "That was cruelty born of my own cowardice. I was angry at my father for forcing the match, angry at myself for not refusing. I took it out on you, and I have been taking it out on you ever since." He reached out, not quite touching her wrist. "I have no right to ask your forgiveness, but I want to try to be someone you might one day look at again." Margaret studied him, the hard lines of his face softer in the moonlight. 3 years of silence cried out inside her, but also 3 years of survival. You cannot unsay what was said. You can only speak differently now and let time decide if the words are true. "Then give me time," he said. She did not promise. She did not smile. But she did not pull her hand away when his fingers brushed hers, and that small allowance felt, to the Duke, like the first glimpse of dawn after a long, dark watch. The scandal sheet arrived on a Tuesday. The Tatler's Whisper ran a column titled "A Duchess Unchaperoned," which danced around the edges of libel with practiced skill. It described Lady M., wife of a certain cold-hearted duke, enjoying excessive familiarity with a well-known widower in gardens and public parks. The piece hinted at continental arrangements and convenient legal loopholes. Margaret read it at the breakfast table, her face draining of color. Within hours, the notice was everywhere. Invitations cooled. Lady Braithwaite sent a stiff note canceling a supper engagement. Margaret's maid reported that a footman from the Sterling household had been turned away at the service entrance with a letter. The Duke summoned Margaret to his study. He held a copy of the Whisper in one hand, and his expression was thunderous. Not at her, she realized, but at the page itself. "This is my fault," he said. "My neglect created the vacancy they are now filling with filth." Margaret stood before his desk, too weary to argue. "It does not matter whose fault it is. The damage is done. Lord Sterling's reputation will suffer, and mine is in tatters." He set the paper down. "I will put a stop to it." She gave a bitter laugh. "How? You cannot sue a scandal column without making the story louder." "Watch me," he said. That night the Duke attended a large supper at the Marquis of Thornwood. Margaret accompanied him, because retreat would only confirm the whispers. She sat rigid beside him, enduring the speculative glances. Halfway through the meal, Lord Thornwood, a pompous man with a voice like a foghorn, raised the topic of modern morals and made a veiled reference to titled ladies who forget their vows. The Duke set down his fork with a deliberate clink. The table quieted. "Lord Thornwood," he said, his tone conversational but carrying the full weight of his authority, "I believe you refer to my wife. Let me be plain. Any rumor of impropriety on her part is a lie. The fault for any estrangement lies with me and me alone. I failed her publicly and privately. She has done nothing but bear it with grace. Anyone who suggests otherwise will answer to me." The silence was absolute. Lady Thornwood's mouth hung slightly open. Margaret stared at her husband, disbelief warring with a traitorous spark of hope. He had defended her, without qualification. Later, however, hope curdled. Leaving the card room, Margaret paused in the corridor to adjust her slipper and heard the Duke's voice from within, speaking to Lord Bexley. "Only sensible course," he was saying. "If I let the story stand, it taints the Ashworth name. A public defense costs me nothing but a few words." "So it was purely strategy?" Bexley asked. "What else would it be?" Margaret's hand froze on the wall. The spark inside her guttered and died. She straightened her shoulders, walked quietly back to the supper room, and smiled through the remainder of the evening as though nothing had happened. The next morning she sent a note to Lord Stirling, accepting his offer of escort to the continent. She packed a single trunk. She wrote a brief, unemotional letter to the Duke, informing him that she would be traveling abroad for an indefinite period and that she wished him well. She did not mention love or hurt or the conversation she had overheard. She simply folded the paper, sealed it with wax, and left it on the corner of his desk. By noon, a hired coach carried her toward Dover. London receded behind her, gray and indifferent, and Margaret pressed her forehead to the cool glass and watched it go. The Duke found the letter at 3 in the afternoon. He read it twice. The words were polite, impersonal, and devastating. For several heartbeats he simply stood there, the paper trembling in his grip. Then a sound escaped him, not a shout, but a low, broken exhalation that had more in common with a wound than with anger. He shouted for his horse. He did not summon a carriage. It would be too slow. He rode out of London in the clothes he stood up in, galloping through the failing light, pushing the animal harder than he had ever pushed anything. The roads blurred. His mind replayed fragments. Her face in the conservatory, her quiet words about that overheard conversation years ago, her weary acceptance of his so-called strategy. He had told Bexley it was only reputation. He had lied to his oldest friend because he was too proud to admit the truth. He was terrified. Terrified that she might see his defense as a declaration. Terrified that she might not care. Terrified above all that he had fallen so completely in love with his own wife and had no earthly clue how to tell her. The coaching inn at Dartford was a modest establishment, its yard lit by a single oil lantern swinging in the evening breeze. The Duke's horse clattered in, lathered and blown. He dismounted on unsteady legs and saw, with a surge of desperate relief, the hired coach drawn up near the stables. Margaret stood beside it, a small valise at her feet, speaking quietly to Lord Stirling. Stirling saw the Duke first and stiffened. Margaret turned, and her expression went blank with shock. The Duke walked toward her. His boots were muddy. His cravat was askew. His eyes were red-rimmed from the wind or perhaps from something else. He stopped a few paces away, and for a long moment no one spoke. "You came," she said, and her voice had no warmth. "I came," he said. "I rode like a madman. I nearly killed the horse." He swallowed. "Margaret, I heard you in the corridor last night. I know you believe my defense was nothing but a performance." She lifted her chin. "Was it not?" "I lied to Bexley." The words tumbled out, raw and unpolished. "I lied because I was too much of a coward to admit the truth even to myself. I did not defend you because of the family name. I defended you because the thought of anyone speaking ill of you makes me feel like I cannot breathe. Because you have always been, the one thing in my life that I was too arrogant to value, and now I am watching you leave and I cannot bear it." Sterling shifted his weight. Margaret held up a hand to quiet him, her eyes fixed on the Duke. "You humiliated me for years," she said, her voice low. "You made me invisible. How do I trust that this is not another whim? How do I know you will not grow bored of sincerity and retreat into mockery again?" The Duke of Ashworth, a man who had never knelt to anyone, lowered himself slowly to one knee in the grimy inn-yard, heedless of the mud, heedless of Sterling's astonished stare. "You don't know," he said. "You cannot know, but I am asking for the chance to show you, court you, properly, publicly. From the beginning, as if we had just met and I had just discovered that the woman across the room was worth more than my entire estate. Let me earn what I never deserved. I will wait as long as you need. I will wait forever." The inn-yard was silent. A horse stamped. Somewhere in the inn a woman laughed. Margaret looked down at him, her husband, kneeling in the dirt. She had not begged. She had walked away. And now he was here, not because she had demanded it, but because he had finally, truly understood. "Get up," she said softly. He rose, hope and fear warring in his face. She turned to Lord Sterling. "My lord, I am grateful beyond measure for your kindness, but I find I must return to London. I have something to see through." Sterling bowed, disappointment flickering but dignity intact. "I understand. I wish you both well." He climbed into the coach and the driver clucked to the horses. The Duke stood motionless as if afraid that any sudden movement might break the spell. Margaret met his eyes. "You said you would court me. I am going to hold you to that, every day, in full view of the world, no shortcuts." He exhaled shakily. "Every day, I swear it." She nodded once and the ghost of a smile crossed her lips. "Then take me home. We have a season to finish." The summer months unfolded like a long, golden afternoon. True to his word, the Duke of Ashworth courted his wife with a diligence that amazed the ton. He sent flowers, not extravagant hothouse displays, but small, meaningful bouquets of the lavender and rosemary she favored. He wrote notes in his own hand, brief and often awkward, but achingly sincere. He escorted her to the theater and listened to her opinions about the play with genuine attention. He danced with her at Almack's, his hand correctly placed, his gaze never wandering. Society watched with the avid fascination of theater-goers at a new drama. Was it a performance? A wager? Some whispered that the Duke had been brought low by a clever schemer. Others, wiser, noted the growing ease between the couple, the way Margaret's laughter came more freely, the way the Duke's hand would rest at the small of her back with unconscious protectiveness. Autumn arrived, and with it, the final grand ball of the season at Hartmore House, the same ballroom, with the same glittering chandeliers, where he had once made her a cruel jest. Margaret stood near the same wall where she had once stood invisible, but everything else had changed. She wore a gown of deep emerald silk, her hair dressed with simple elegance, her head high. The Duke crossed the room toward her, and the crowd parted as it had once parted for her retreat. This time, however, the expressions were not of scandal but of quiet expectation. He stopped before her and offered a formal bow. "Lady Ashworth," he said, his voice carrying in the expectant hush, "might I have the honor of escorting you into supper?" A murmur rippled. It was the most public acknowledgment of their marriage he had ever made, a statement, not a jest. Margaret smiled, a true smile that reached her eyes. "You may, Your Grace, it would be my pleasure." He offered his arm. She took it. The quartet struck up a waltz, and instead of going directly to supper, he led her onto the floor. They moved together with the ease of long practice, though in truth they had only recently learned each other's rhythms. "I have a confession," the Duke murmured as they turned. "I chose this ball deliberately." "I suspected as much," Margaret said. "You have a flair for the dramatic when properly motivated." His mouth quirked. "I wanted to replace the memory, the one I gave you here. I wanted to give you a different story." She considered him. this proud, difficult, evolving man who had dismantled himself piece by piece and rebuilt something better. "You have," she said, "but you should know the old memory does not sting anymore. It only reminds me how far we have come." They danced until the music ended, and then he led her not to the supper room but through the French doors onto the terrace. The autumn air was crisp, the sky scattered with stars. A few couples lingered, but the Duke guided her to a quiet corner near a stone balustrade. "Margaret," he said, and stopped. He seemed to be gathering words, a man who had once wielded them like weapons now struggling to find the right ones. "I told you I would court you. And I have. I told you I would wait, and I have. I have not asked for anything you were not ready to give. But tonight I must tell you something plainly, with no cleverness and no pride." She waited. "I love you," he said. "Not the idea of you, not the duty of you. You, your stubbornness, your grace, your refusal to be diminished. I love the way you read Blake until the candles burned down. I love the way you speak to servants as if they matter. I love that you made me silent in a ballroom and then refused to let me off the hook for 3 entire seasons. I am asking, Margaret, if you might, if you could ever." She placed 2 fingers against his lips, stopping the flood of words. His eyes widened. "Alexander," she said, using his name for the first time in their marriage. "I began to love you, I think, on the day you knelt in the mud, but I needed to be certain it was not gratitude. I needed to know you would keep showing up day after ordinary day when the grand gestures were over. You have, and so I will give you my answer now." She removed her fingers. "I love you too, and I am ready to be your wife in all the ways that matter if you are still willing." The sound he made was somewhere between a laugh and a sob. He cupped her face in his hands and kissed her, not a chaste brush, but a deep, reverent kiss that carried 3 years of silence and several months of patient hope. A few onlookers gasped, then smiled, then politely looked away. When they parted, Margaret was smiling through a film of tears. "We should probably go inside. People will talk." "Let them talk," the Duke said, and his voice was rough with joy. "For the first time in my life, I want them to. I want the whole world to know that Lady Margaret Ashworth is my wife, and that I am the most fortunate man in England." She laughed, and the sound was bright and unguarded, and together they walked back into the ballroom, arm in arm, into a future that had been hard won and all the more precious for it.